the end of the meeting.
Yeah, we'll do that with the Q&A and whatever happens, and then might include some of this, and then we're pretty much through anyway, so we have a big Q&A. But let's just see where this goes, and then we take it from there.
Okay, great.
All right. So give you a couple of ballpark numbers to start with. This is referring, of course, not for all the films that are being shot, because films are being shot like crazy. This is going to the ones that get a theatrical release. And half of all of those films are actually profitable. Some more, some less. Horror is the most profitable genre, because when they have outbreak hits, they break out really high. And on the other hand, horror is very cost effective to produce. You also do not need any names for that, unless, of course, you have a well-known horror director. That helps a lot. But it's not necessary, like for a lot of other films, to get an A or B lister or at least a recognizable name. So that gives you a lot of options here. Personally, I think I mentioned it before, not the biggest fan of horror, but especially with this with this company that I'm setting up with a director who is a horror director, I will probably be shooting one next year.
Oh, nice.
Actually, more producing. They'll be doing the shooting because I can only spoil it.
Okay, cool.
All right. The top 6% of all these firms account for half of the profits. So that's really something. It's a niche product, more or less, while the bottom 6% account for half of all the losses. The rest gets spread out there, but still, half of all films are profitable, which is better than the usual rule of thumb. Generally, people say 2 hits and 10 flops. That is pretty much the ballpark number for the studios, but this is also including the independents and is a broader database. And then, of course, we know don't trust any statistic that you haven't forged yourself. So these are ballpark numbers, helpful for the orientation, also helpful sometimes for if you put together a pitch. But, as we can remember from all of the other sessions, and especially session 1, nobody knows anything. But these are some numbers that you can work for that are more or less considered industry standard too. So another number, and that is actually one that works pretty well, or used to work pretty well before the market has changed so greatly over the last 2 years. The budget times 2 is an indicator for a profitable film. That is a statistic actually that still the BFI stands by, the British Film Institute. And it means that if your budget is 100 million and you make 200 at the box office, you will have a profitable film by the time it goes to all of the value chain. That, however, is still referring pretty much to the old model. And as we know, a lot of things have changed. Not really thanks to the streamers. So if you just sell your movie to the streamer, of course, there will be different economics. We'll be briefly looking at that too. There are surprise hits that, for example, had very bad box office and turned into cult movies on DVD. And DVD, of course, being not anywhere near where it used to be, has changed this too. So these days, having something that is not a theatrical hit and does well on DVD is still a viable option sometimes, because the physical DVDs are picking up a little bit. But with the way that the value change has basically changed from going theatrical, DVD, pay TV, TV, and the whole value change, and now either goes straight to a streamer that buys all the rights and generally has not started licensing it out, means that you only have one part of the value chain to recover your film, which is okay if you work with the streamers and have the contracts that guarantee your profit. But as we will see when we get to the streamer page, has a lot of things to be considered. So the old model does not really work as much. There is glimmer of hope that it's coming back a little bit, but it would be irresponsible of me to make people believe that they will be able to exploit the film in all of these parts of the value chain, It is just the exception to the rule right now. And it used to be a fine rule, used to be a good rule, because you could basically finance a film with enough pre-sales, enough territories that they went to, and make some decent profits. Anyway, we'll be looking at that in the respective pages. The main, I'm not going to say problem, but the main aspect that you will have to take into consideration is, of course, how to distribute your films. If you can work with a classic strategy, which would mean being able to get a theatrical release and not selling to the streamers. You might have heard about the last example, actually the Brad Pitt and George Clooney project, Wolves on Apple, was supposed to go theatrical, and Apple had basically committed to a couple of theatrical releases. But since they spent billions on films like Flower Moon, on what was the Scorsese film that was so bad? With the
No.
remember which of the Irishman? Irishman, yeah. Mm-hmm. And all of those movies pretty much cost them 100 million, 120, 120, 200 million. They could afford that because for them it was also some kind of cheap advertising, because all of the money they spent, they got so many media dollars, so many reports, and so many new subscriptions that it did make sense, because they work with different economics. For them, of course, they need the subscription, they need growth, and they need stock prices to rise. And they could do that for a while, but after spending about $1 billion on films and having almost no success at the box office, they of course can't carry that on forever. So Apple has just a couple of weeks actually published their plans to strongly reduce the number of theatrical releases they are doing. So that is not a very good sign at this stage. But the classical ways do still work for some productions, especially if you're not selling out to the streamers. So there are 3 stages then of distribution. It goes to the licensing, basically meaning selling and licensing to different territories, different countries, and different parts of the value chain. That, of course, has to be marketed. And not only that, also the logistics of shipping your, in that case, now it's not celluloid anymore. Most of it, of course, is digital. Still, the digital reproduction and sending still costs money. And in some cases, just look at the IMAX project of the last movie, of the Oppenheimer film. If you have seen some of the memes, maybe, or some of the photos of the shipping of the big digital copies that they had to send, you can imagine that even sending 3,000 or 4,000 out to that all over the country in the US or all over the world is, of course, very consuming, very money consuming. The other parts of distribution that are still relevant, of course, is applying to and hopefully being accepted to film festivals. That, of course, is a very slim chance, and especially to the top ones. It's not easy to get in there, but it's, of course, a proper way if you have a good product, and there's always surprises there. So it certainly makes sense if you have something that fits their target to send it out to the right film festivals. Film markets are generally combined to the festivals, as for example in Cannes, the Mashhedi film during the Cannes Film Festival, Toronto, Venice, Berlin. Those are pretty much the big ones. We will have to see, we mentioned it before, American film market. We'll see how that happens in November and how that does. But those are the places where you can meet sales agent, where you can meet the distributors for the respective countries. And if you have a good product, if you prepare all those meetings in time and set up meetings, in time meaning starting contacting them at least 2 months in advance, you can get their meetings, you can pitch your project, and that might be coming in helpful. Also, if you get some of the bigger distributors, even today on a rare occasion, they still come in with money for securing their territories and partially financing your production. There are producers reps, a lot of them. 90% are, let me say that nicely, what's a nice word for crooks? And they also charge a lot of money sometimes upfront for sometimes promotional material. A lot of that, which we can these days do ourselves if we have somebody with graphics in there, because of course with the AI, everything else being out there, that makes it a whole lot easier. Also, a little warning, don't do too much of the obvious AI because that looks actually cheaper than one that's done by a real artist. So the last point of the distribution list here are the aggregators, and the aggregators are actually the one that bring your project to streaming. We'll also be talking about that. So when do you start approaching everybody? You can do that pretty much at any stage, in the financing stage, during the festivals, if you are there, during the markets, which of course you have to start setting up your appointments in before. Sometimes actually, if you're at the markets and you haven't done your proper work before, or you just happen to be there for the festival, you might be able to get a day pass. And if you go in there, you will have to pay for that, of course, but if you go and get in there, the best tip is to come as early as it starts, because thanks to the events at the festivals, a lot of the early appointments do get canceled, and you might be able to get a walk-in. That's like a little sneaky trick on the side to keep in mind. The other thing is when you have your film finished, then of course, if you announce it, the acquisition executives, and this is especially relevant, of course, especially to the American market, they track the progress of each film. Once it's announced on the film catalog, for example, as being finished, the ones in the US actually have to go and see it because that's part of their job. But that's strictly for the Americans in our seminars here. But it's good to know. But if you announce it still, and if you get the attention of the acquisition executives, for example, in the respective publications, I'm not sure about Switzerland right now, but I think Blickpunkt Film is probably as relevant in Switzerland as it is in Germany, at least in the German-speaking. If you put an ad in there or contact them, that might help you. And of course, the other via sales agents that work all year round, but you can meet them best at the markets. The agreements now are, in the best case, a PFD agreement, which means the studio picks up your film and pays for P, production, F, filming, and D, distribution. F, of course, stands for financing. Sorry, I don't know why I stumbled there. Being in the finance business and knowing what the F stands for, that's really embarrassing. So it's production, financing, and distributing. That's the best case. It used to be quite frequently. It has definitely gotten a whole lot less. Negative pickup is what still happens sometimes at the festivals and Sundance. And negative pickup means they like your film and they buy it outright there, sometimes for a very, very good profit. Still another good situation, but much rarer than it used to be. The markets are a little weak, hopefully coming back a little bit, but they are far from where they used to be before Corona. The good old model, of course, was a pre-sale, which basically meant you said, okay, I have an A-list director, I have a recognizable star, we have a decent budget, and we will sell to, let's say, Italy, France, Germany, whatever. Sometimes in the good old days, you used to be able to finance a film just by having pre-sales during the markets. Yeah, it had a lot of other implications that we will be talking about or had talked about during the distribution long presentation we made. So you have to make sure, of course, that you hold on to your rights and that they do not move over to the distributor. For example, some of them do go bankrupt, and your project, if it's not properly secured with you as the owner and the one who has the hand on it, might mean that your product might be held up in bankruptcy court. So there's a lot of things here to be considered, but just like I said, we spoke about that in the distribution thing. And when it comes to distribution, we can certainly follow up on the Q&As. A sales agent agreement is very good if you have a proper, successful sales agent who is known to handle projects in your genre. Make sure you don't grant them any rights, because that also means it can be either caught up in copyright cases or might lead to some problems. There are all a lot of things to be considered, which I can, of course, give you some pointers, but all of these needs to be verified with an attorney, attorney, attorney. There's also the possibility, which has become a lot rarer, the so-called rent-a-system deal, which meant that if you had a film, if you produced it, and if you wanted to bring it out in the theaters, you could rent the studios to distribute your films for a lower fee. Lower fee because they had, of course, less to work with, and they didn't have to pay for the prints and advertising, because generally you always had to pay for the prints and for the advertising, which easily goes anywhere between 5 and 20 million for any film, or for the tentpole pictures, we know they spend about 100 million. But 5 to 20, even for a limited release, is a good ballpark number. And you can, of course, finance that like you finance your film. But we all know it's not easy to find money. But it had the advantage of, like, if you had a name, if you had the money, that you got a whole lot better distribution deal. However, there was always a conflict of interest, because the studio would, of course, if they have your film or a studio film, and they generally bring one out every other weekend anyway, there might be a conflict of interest, and they would pay better attention to their film. But it could be very profitable under the right circumstances. And of course, the thing everybody's talking about now that does work in certain cases, does take a lot of effort, sometimes even money, but a lot of attention and eyeballs, social media, and is the self-distribution. And I have some fine examples for that in the end, how it was actually done profitably, which is also, of course, not the rule, as we know by now. So you have to make very sure with your rights, no matter which way you're going. And also, if you're going theatrical, non-theatrical, or streaming, which rights you have, which rights you give away, for how long, and what might be the implications that can hit you. Home entertainment DVD is fortunately, like I said, coming back. You might remember last time or the one time before I mentioned that DVD used to be responsible for 40% of the revenue of the films, even in times of theatrical, and theatrical was only 25%. But of course, theatrical raises the awareness and is the locomotive to pull the train through with all of the wagons behind it. Subscription video on demand, transactional video on demand, where you pay for every film you see, or advertising video on demand. Right now, everybody's pretty much calling it FAST, for free advertising supported TV. All of these ways are part of the value chain. If you're lucky, if you sell to a screamer, sorry, Dr. Freud, to a streamer in the first place, of course, you will give up all of your rights and he will exploit it in all of these. So that's a situation. We'll get back to that briefly on the streaming side. The other ways of exploiting your film would be on TV, on pay, on cable, and on free TV. You might be able to sell or license that, unless, of course, the streamers have taken all the rights. But the ancillary rights for merchandising, for toys, for even theme parks, if you have something, but that's a rare situation for smaller films. Soundtrack on merchandising, all of that are rights that you have, as well as, and you might be very careful to give them away, all of the derivative rights, which basically means if you have any kind of an IP that you develop, a character, for example, and then do a spin-off by developing that character, for example, into the protagonist for a series, another film, another project. All of these rights, you have to be very careful to not sign them away or to get properly paid for that. Sub-license is the same. The considerations, if you get your rights away, you frequently license that, especially if you take any part of the classical way of licensing your film. And then, of course, you always run into the possibility that if somebody sub-licenses your film, you might also be charged of that, unless that is taken care of in your contract. And he might also, if, let's say, you have a 7-year license, he might just license it, sub-license it on the last day of your 7 years, and license it to 15 years to a sub-licenser, unless, of course, that's been excluded in your contract. But if that happens, you have to wait another 15 years for your rights to revert to you. All of these things are relevant for all of the stages of making your film seen and trying to make some money for that. So briefly, if you look for a distributor and you can find one, approach them, like I said, at least 2 months before a market. Better is 3 months for the first email because they usually don't reply anyway. So you can have a nice follow-up at about 70 or 60 days. Investigate them in so far as trying to find out if they are experienced in your genre, if they were successful, if there are any bad experiences that people have made. We were talking about the Facebook groups, about the distributors and everything. Those are pretty good sources right now. And generally only license the territories they serve to avoid the double fees, like I mentioned before, and avoid cross-collateralizing, which is generally only relevant if you have a body of work consisting a library and several firms. Then, of course, some of the rights or some of the profits may be used to cover losses in other territories or in other projects. So all of that will have to be pretty clear. Also, the terms for how long it is and restrict the third-party license terms, as I already mentioned before. So very possible if you have the right product and can sell it to have the split rights for territories, meaning splitting it and giving one distributor for Italy, one for France, because if you have a local one, they have the better connection in general. Plus, you might be able to get more money than if you give it all to one. Unless, of course, you have somebody who comes in with good money and is well positioned, like some of the big ones that there are out there. Basically, I've mentioned all of these things before. And the last one is the important one. Hold on to your rights. ALAB, you might remember ALAB as long as possible and sell them as expensively as possible. So what is left after talking about the distributors here? That is the aggregators. And the aggregators are the ones that bring your firm to the streamers, access to OTT and VOD platforms. They conform to the technical specification. That means they take a lot of problems out of the delivery, and they have the advantage of taking just a flat fee and a small or no profit share. That varies greatly, but they are, as a rule of thumb, cheaper than regular distributors. The reporting, though, for digital is very weak. That's one of the biggest problems. We have a quality and amount of data as we never had before in decades of the film business. And the streamers, have the opportunity. They read, they can tell you, you watch the film for 2 minutes, they watch for 7 minutes, all of that. They have the statistics, but they are very, very secretive about it because, of course, in a transparent market, and it's very intransparent, even though the data exists. If you don't share it, it's always a competitive advantage. So that is definitely a situation. The reporting on the films and whatever they consider as being a film watched. Netflix used to have this rule: if you watch more than 7 minutes, they say you watched the film, and that's called a view. So it is very, very intransparent. Generally, it's not so relevant in the reporting because if you sell to a streamer and if you work with a streamer, you basically do have to give away all your rights and sell your rights in perpetuity, meaning that you will not get any plus or any overages, as they are called, if there's extreme success in other markets. I have the list here, and I think I've shown you before, I'm not quite sure. Basically, this is the list that started in 2019 when on-demand companies started entering the market. We had like 10 pretty much in that year, and it exploded over the years to 252 in 2021. Last is 10 over 1,000, and it's actually not the last because currently we're way over 2,500 that we have out there. So also to get views and to find somebody who's ready, willing, and able to pay, it's important to know the biggest ones. And that is actually Netflix with 240 million, Amazon Prime with 220, Disney Plus, HBO and HBO Max, and Paramount Plus. These are the biggest regular streamers, but it might come in as a very interesting fact that YouTube is actually the most popular and biggest platform who has the most hours watched, and also on films. YouTube is huge and is probably more and more developing in a very good distribution platform. 2 years ago, I used to mention them as an example where films were sometimes uploaded and peppered with 7, 8, or 9 or 10 ads, and there was no money left for the ones. I had a friend of mine actually in Iceland who shot a film there, had quite some success, and was very surprised to find in his film bootlegged on YouTube and peppered with all of those ads. So there were some very, very unhappy experiences made. Nevertheless, you can, of course, you have to watch that, monitor that, and you will see it. But YouTube is a very, very popular, and also since the paying works pretty much with them now, could be a very interesting platform to distribute if you have a community, if you have social media reach, and so on. Facebook Watch is the second popular AVOD platform, but they have very short films. I actually hate that. It's very, very negative. It's a lot of people either trying to act like like freaking idiots, and trying to elicit reactions from other people, or provocations or fights, and it's very negative. And they have the second most in hours, and of course, due to the Facebook connection, a lot of advertising income, but it's certainly nothing to show your film, if I may say so. Peacock is pretty good with NBC Universal, 14% of the market. Roku and Tubi with around 10% there. So there's a lot of these companies, but very few that catch the biggest part in market share, of course, as anywhere else. So now I've mentioned it a couple of times. Let's get to the streamers. They basically started buying films and licensing them, and also licensing them as part of the value chain, and pretty quickly got into production. You might remember the statistic that Netflix actually was producing more films than all of the major studios together over the last years, which is a frightening statistic. They have, and they require, 100% ownership. There will be no back end, no copyright, and no ownership for you, which also means that as an artist, if you're trying to build a body of work, if you're trying to have a library, and a library is, of course, what kind of in the end guarantees the value of a company and of your work, because things like, I mentioned Casablanca before, look at Shawshank Redemption or whatever, all these films are making money every day because they run at hundreds of TV stations worldwide and demand license fees. So if you have anything like that, that used to be a beautiful, beautiful part of the income. If you sell, however, to the streamer, you basically have the so-called cost plus model, which means they say, okay, you produce that film for 2 million, we'll pay you 2.5 million or 3 million, and then you deliver it. That is all the money you will ever see. It had the advantage that the production was financed and you were sure to make a profit. They actually were so successful with that that sometimes now they still give you the contract, but they don't even pay for the financing anymore, which means from a producer's side that you will still have to borrow the money via investors, via film financing banks, or however, to finance the cash flow. And then they pay on delivery. That is an actually even worse deal. However, you are still assured to make a profit if you work properly. So it's like a safe bet with no upside potential. Also, of course, you have to have access to the streamers, which is hard to find and generally via anointed persons only, meaning somebody who has a good workmanship relation with them already. The alternative, which is developing and coming out nicely, is advertising. And we were talking about that. I mentioned that briefly. There are companies out there, and they are merchandising companies, product placement, some of them, some broker that quite a few are actually not too bad. A lot of black sheep in the business, but if you have a decent one or work with a good attorney, there are companies out there that, like Adidas, for example, spent $6 million for 3 films on soccer, on football. And of course, with the Adidas shoes, that is a very good promotional tie-in and might make perfect sense. So the thing to more and more watch out for are corporations to come in for the financing. Lego, for example, and Transformers had a great deal. And we all know the good old example with James Bond, Aston Martin, Omega watches, all of that, where they even have the cross advertising, where basically Omega has the opportunity and is responsible to place ads between 5 and 20 million. And all of the ads have the James Bond character, car, or whatever integrated. So actually, the James Bond film does get the cross promotion to all of these markets too. That's actually a classical, one of the few real win-win situations. Generally, when somebody tries to tell you a win-win situation and tries to sell you a win-win situation, it's 2 wins for them and none for you, especially in the film business. So you really got to watch out. But that's a beautiful example. So after all of this horror, all of this, and all of the last seasons too, I do have a few examples here on how independently films and independently self-distributed ones can be profitable. There is a good example of a London production called Papadopoulos and Sons, a Greek film, which has part of the story a fish and chip store of this Greek guy. And the best way, of course, is always to build attention, a theatrical release. So he did rent a theater. We'll be looking at a few of those aspects in a minute, and made about $40,000 in 1 week by renting out Cineworld Cinema in London and advertising all of that proper. That was a second highest screen average in that week. Only Tom Cruise did more business. That shows you how good a P&R effort these guys put in there. So fortunately, then the film was, after raising this attention, being widely reported upon in the trades, in the newspapers that are working and reporting on the film business. It was picked up by the BBC, by Arte, which is the French-German company, and Netflix. So he got a 100 screen release in Germany after the initial success here, DVD distribution in the US and in Australia. Also, it got sold to dozens of airlines, and all of this was started by a campaign that was highly targeted to the Greek community in all of the relevant countries. He targeted it very well by, among other things, inviting the Greek Orthodox priest, and he actually, sorry with my religious terms, which might be quite appropriate, but he basically blessed the film and the premiere. He also did very targeted marketing to fish and chip stores. Everybody who has a store, who goes there, or is somehow related to that, or even works there, or has one, or likes one, whatever, was highly targeted via Facebook's ad. So he did spend quite some money on that, as we will see. But he spent $5,200 for renting the theater, £325 on the printing fees for the copy, 1,000 for the BBFC certificate to be able to show it here in the theater, 2,000 for renting the drives to be able to show his digital copy, 2,000 for a publicist. That is not to be neglected. Publicists and PR, you got to have the right people for that. 4,000 was the commission for Miracle Entertainment. They coordinated the deal and supported him with, of course, advice. £3,000 for radio ads, and you see again highly targeted on the London Greek radio, and print ads in the Greek newspapers in London. £8,000, which is probably less than you would have thought, at least it was less than I would have thought, on Facebook ads, and also targeted to those with Greek interests living in areas close to Greek churches. I mean, if you target it like that, if your audience is consists of these people, pretty good. That's why it's also important when you, like, as I said before, reverse engineering a movie, think about your target group. 10,000 for posters, flyers, and a pre-release screening of the making-of documentary. So he had expenses of about 35,000. The income was 96,000 gross. That was what he has had at cinema tickets that he sold. So minus the tax, that's always the thing. VAT goes right off the top. You hear the huge box office numbers without, and then generally forgot the sales tax or the VAT that goes on top. That's 20%, left him with about 76,000. Cineworld cut, they got 65%, which is high, especially if you're at the theater. If you're lucky, you can have a better deal where they get a lower commission. Half and half is generally fair as a ballpark number. Sometimes if you pay that much in advance, you might be able to get it a little lower in these days because, of course, cinemas are not that well booked. Also, additional screenings that he had brought in another 19K. So he basically made 45,000 pounds here with no distribution fee that he had to pay to anybody and no sales agent fee. If that would be the income and if this would be handled by a sales agent with a 30% commission, he would only be at $30,000 instead of the 45,000. He then got 50,000 from BBC. He got a minimum guarantee from Germany and Greece. Minimum guarantee, of course, means upfront payment and then hopefully getting overages. Rare that you get them, but the 50K on top of that, all of that added up. He also then licensed it out via aggregators to, as you can see, Netflix, Filmflex, iTunes, Blinkbox. He made 26 pounds from Blinkbox. Probably paid more money on mailings, but still, everything counts. 95 on Google, and another 10,000 from miscellaneous ones, from several smaller ones. But that already was another 34,000 income here. And that was already the net income because, as you might remember from the aggregators file, they charged just a very small percentage. So this was the money that already hit his bank on top of the money and the 40,000 profit that he made from the theatrical. He had spent about 800,000 on the film, which made him get 158,000 from the UK tax credit, and that's one of the models I explained once before. If you get a tax credit, either you can borrow money against it if you find somebody to finance that and thereby spend more on production, or like in this case, which is actually better, if the film is fully financed, you already have money flowing back to you and your investors. So 158,000 came out of the UK tax credit, which evens to about 25%. 88,000 from TV, the 45,000 from the theatrical, the 34,000 from VOD, 32,000 from the airlines, 15,000 actually. He made a profit from Germany theatrical, which is quite a success. A lot of films in theatrical a lot of times is the loss leader, but it pays for the attention. But he even made a profit from that. 12,000 out of Greece, 10,000 out of DVD, a US screening brought in 1,100, and speaking fees 275, 450 from another UK screening. That came after about a year and a half to about 400,000 pounds recoupment already. So if he keeps making money, if he keeps getting a few more salaries, he will be making a fine profit already. Plus, let's not forget, he's got his producer's money already. Investors are being paid, and it was picked up by BBC, by Arte, and Netflix. So there's also more money coming in over the next TV licenses once the first ones, depending on how short they are. If they are 3 years to 4, which is rare, they are probably more like 7 years. But then there's more money coming in there anyway. So, of course, in the meantime, more money has flown in from DVD distribution, US and Australia. I don't have the current numbers because he's secretive about it. There's a good reason for it because it's probably pretty profitable by now. But see, they were very targeted. They said they sold to Lufthansa and Cathay Pacific, and we all know they have quite a good program. So that's basically a compliment to the film, I would say. And oh yeah, he targeted the fans of Zorbas, the Greeks. So he also like there were groups for the films and Greek films. That was also part of the marketing for the heavily targeted, especially Facebook ads. So this is how film can be pretty profitable and recoup money. Generally takes 2 to 3 years for a film to recoup. So he was after a year and a half already more than halfway there. The other example is from around the corner here, which is actually pretty good. It's out of Bristol. I don't know the guy, but I was made aware of it here from a distributor, and he netted $100,000 from a 2,000 pound horror movie. He started, and that's the thing that I tell a lot of people that do make shorts, rather make a feature film than make a short, because it's very hard to get any money at all ever on shorts. But feature films might turn into surprise hits or might be picked up for a remake or whatever. So the film was originally called Labyrinthia. The genre was the one I mentioned before, why to choose it, horror movie. He made a good trailer, he put it on MDB, sent invitation to all of the movie magazines, and actually got a few write-ups, and got the contact of a sales company, sent it out there. And the sales company said, I think it was 70 minutes. So they said, we need an additional 20 minutes. And good marketing gag, of course, they changed the title to Dead Man Apocalypse. Labyrinthia, whatever. Dead Man Apocalypse is certainly a title that catches the attention on the streamers. So he made $100,000 in sales on DVD and VOD via HMV, which is one of the chains here in the UK, Asda and Tesco supermarket chains, compared to, you might remember what I told you about Walmart and the DVD sales. So that was pretty effective. Sainsbury, another supermarket here. Video on demand on Sky, Apple, and Amazon. And he got commissioned to produce 2 more films per year. Of course, with a little higher budget than 2000. I don't know the exact numbers, but we can be pretty sure that they are anywhere between at least 50,000 in the worst case scenario, and probably 200,000, more like that. So that's how you can get a 2000 film and end up with 100,000. Basically, profits out of that is probably around 80. Yeah, so we see all the numbers out there. I spread a lot of horror. I had 2 beautiful examples here. I have another one of the documentary Burn, which is a documentary that was shot about firefighters. There are 2 million firefighters in the US, so that was highly targeted. They made showings in all of the fire departments. They made word of mouth advertising, and they actually had about $1 million within a year and a half out of those showings. That, of course, the families of the firefighters, they took their families and friends to, and they had a lot of, it's also a good atmosphere if you show it in, for example, the community home right next to the fire department, or even in the fire department. That was a very, very big success for a documentary. So we have all the ranges out there. We have to make sure, and we see it, all of this here basically goes towards the highly, highly targeted films. Okay, so this is basically it. And now I'm ready for all of your questions.
Okay, great. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wrote down my questions before this. So
Okay,
it's about a bit everything that we looked at,
cool.
or just that from every lesson. One thing I was asking myself is, for this tax money, do you need to apply for that and they just
Yes.
pick? Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
You have to qualify for it and you have to apply for it. And qualifications include such things as the minimum you spend. Like if you, for example, if you go to California, it's about $1 million. If you do it in New Hampshire or in Maine, it's 50,000, or Massachusetts. So it depends, of course, on how low the numbers are. There are, of course, a lot of, and that's some good information about comparisons of the locales. Generally, I think It's hard to give a ballpark number because it spreads so widely. But for smaller projects like 5, 10,000, 50,000 or whatever, you will probably not be getting anything.
Ah, okay.
Because even if your budget is 60, 70,000, you will not be spending 70,000 in one place because sometimes above the line, meaning the cast does not qualify, and you will have to hire a certain number of crew in the locale. So you have to have a certain size of that to be able to apply for the tax money.
Ah, okay. Yeah,
Mhm.
that makes sense. Um, One question was just answered now
Okay.
in this session. Um, yeah, I was still wondering why these films they didn't make profit with high numbers
Yeah.
of on the box office and everything. Uh, did they not calculate it right? I mean, it shouldn't.
Oh, they did. They did it
Uh,
calculate so right because it was calculated by the studio, and they have the opportunity to charge their distribution fee first, for example. And so the studio has like all of these sub companies, these single purpose companies. They have their studio, they have the lot wherever that can be rented. So they make money on that already during the production. They charge for that. They also have a profit on that. They do the distribution. That money gets paid first. So they have already when we let's go briefly to that Harry Potter thing. There was like 600 million or whatever already, and 300 million distribution fee. So the distribution fee was paid for the studio. They had the 300 million already in the bank. So they already made 300 million out of that. They also got money on the production because they rented out the studio lot, they rented out the shop to build everything. All of that was charged to the film. So the money didn't really leave the studio, but was already there and got taken off from all the money coming in before any profits were there. And that was, of course, kind of eating up the profits.
and they knew that in advance that it's probably not making profit or.
Yeah, yeah, because if there's enough money coming in, they can charge enough money on that. They have enough flexibility on that. So even if they don't know, like let's say if there's not enough money coming in, they would still be losing money.
Mm.
So you have to have, of course, a certain box office numbers to be able to recoup your expenses. But if you can raise your expenses and make money first before everybody else makes money, all the money that gets paid out before everybody else makes money goes, of course, on top of the expenses.
Mhm.
So basically, then the studio has the expenses. On the other hand, the income comes into another entity where, for example, like let's look at distribution. They made $300 million on that, but they lost money on other films. So they
Mm.
don't have to pay taxes on the 300. They maybe lost 150 million on other films. So they only pay on 150 million. So tax-wise for the studio, it is just money being moved back and forth. It all ends up in the big corporate company over there. But if you have your contract with one of the companies down below, that company might be, if you're lucky, highly profitable because it's distribution, or it might lose money because it's profit participation.
Mm.
That
And
is, that's
uh,
why we say the real creative people in Hollywood are the accountants.
yeah. So could it be that they knew already it's not going to make money, but they wanted to do it for advertising their studio or whatever to show we making this great film
No,
or
they're always hoping that it will make money.
okay.
But the profit participants
Mhm.
can be, I'm not going to say cut out, but they can be badly accommodated. Let me phrase that very carefully. If I have the right terms, if I have the ability to kind of upscale my expenses, for example, if you have a top director, they usually get money when certain box office numbers are hit, or they get the first dollar gross. Like if you have 100 million and you have Tom Cruise and you pay him 20 million, you already have your budget raised to 120 million before anybody else makes any profits. So there's been profit and there's been money paid out, and Tom Cruise has his money, the distributor has his money, but the ones that are waiting in line lower in the packing order will not see any money because everything gets piled on top of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I have more questions.
Yeah.
Okay, I could maybe also check this on Google, but this net money for the, how much is this in average for the actors, for example? Is a percentage from the
From the
profit, right?
gross, yeah, from what is at the box office. So if like let's say you hear this movie made 100 million at the box office, and they get 20%, they take off a couple of the customary expenses, but the ballpark number is 20 million.
Mm.
There are expenses that they take off because they also have the definition of certain gross. They have like first dollar gross, they have gross after expenses. It's also a lot of bookkeeping tricks, and it depends, and that's why it's so important to have the right contract and to look at it, which expenses are deductible before break even or before gross. Gross, but generally though means very little expenses taken off. And then, of course, the VAT gets taken off, or the sales tax, that's for sure. But everything else means that money, they have the first dollar gross, that they get the first money that comes in, being distributed. That's so important there in that context. We spoke about the waterfall and how that's being distributed, and the contracts, who is in what place in the waterfall and gets how much of the money coming in. That is basically the thing that leads to a lot of misunderstandings or unhappy investors.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is a very complex thing, which
Yeah.
actually even one seminar wouldn't be enough for that. That's actually like a bookkeeping's auditing seminar for forever.
Yeah.
Because waterfall is also relevant for all kinds of development. It's not just in the film business. It's basically the distribution of money coming in, how it's being distributed by the involved parties. So it's definitely an economic term that's out there.
Okay, interesting. I used to study mathematics for 3
Oh, wow, yeah, you'll have fun here.
years.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then that's maybe something else I just want to ask you personally with your experience in the film industry, these screenplay festivals. Is this a good thing to enter or not?
If it's one with a name, that can work, but there's like even some of the winners, or what's the one called? The one that says the name, some guy, I can't think of it right now. There are some that are reputable, very few. For a reputable one, it is okay and it does make sense. But all the ones that are out there, it's just fee collectors.
Yeah.
I can't think of the name right now. What's the one called? I'm not a writer, so I keep forgetting, but there's one that is very reputable. If you win one of those, it's already quite a recommendation.
Atlanta,
And
maybe.
still no guarantee that your project ever gets made.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I want to
It's
say
never a guarantee.
yeah, yeah, true.
Until
Nobody knows anything, huh?
yeah. So it's interesting. Do we have another session or was this the last one?
I think it was the last one, but I'm not quite sure. I'll have to double check. But we can certainly do a follow-up because it was fun. I enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know, and then we'll do a follow-up. Yeah. Or you can tell me about your project or any specific questions. I'm really not quite sure of this, but we'll do another one.
Oh,
For
cool.
the one I missed out. Yeah, I got to make up for that.
Oh, okay. Next time I tell you about my project a
Yeah,
bit.
great.
Yeah, yeah.
And then if you have any other questions, sure. We'll do another one and take it from there.
Okay, great. That's
Great.
it.
Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you
it's
too.
actually good because I'm not myself yet, so I have to force myself to go out and do all of this stuff. So thank you for, otherwise I would be lying on my couch watching YouTube now.
Okay, thank you too.
Thank you very much.
Get
Have a
better.
lovely day.
Yeah.
See you next week.
See you next week. But
Cheers.
get better soon.